Great Wednesday. Sorry about that. Welcome to the King Connections podcast. I'm your host, King. I'm here today with my guest today, Doug Lawrence, whose second appearance in the King Connections podcast. Doug is an author, and what really has me inspired and looking forward to this interview, mainly because I'm being impacted by the topic today, which is going to be grief and how to deal with grief. But Doug has been great as far as writing about that topic, being involved in that space, having a nonprofit that, and meetup groups that dealing with grief. So without any further ado, I want to allow Doug Lawrence. Welcome to the King Connections podcast.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on your show.
And for our listening audience, before we begin, one of the questions I have to ask because it kind of sets a tone for our show, is what's your spiritual energy number? Being from zero being life sucks to 10 being life is awesome, kind of in the moment. What would you say your spiritual energy number is right now?
9.
No. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for answering that question. Again, for those who may be new to this or new to the show, the reason I asked that question, because what I've learned is that when people are vibrating at a level of 8 or better for their spiritual energy number, that has nothing to do with anything about religion, but just about how you are dealing with emotionally, mentally, physically, where your energy is. If it's above a 7 or better, then we're going to have a great show, and we're going to bring that topic and discussion to the energy to the show. So thank you for answering that. So what I want to do now is transition into, why don't you share a brief bio of why our listeners should be listening to you today, which you feel is the most important parts of your bio that encapsulates the importance of our topic today for the show.
I certainly can. So, I'm a retired Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer, and I served for 25 years. And as a result of my service and dealing with trauma and all things surrounding that, I ended up with post traumatic stress. And I didn't have the support group, the community to be able to reach out to be able to deal with it. So as a result of that, there were some hard lessons that had to be learned, and those were part of that. I do volunteer mentoring and working with uh, ACP, American Corporate Partners in the U.S., helping military personnel transition from service to civilian life, and in a lot of cases, helping them also understanding what they're going through from the aspect of mental health and those things. And the other piece of interesting for me is that I'm also a volunteer mentor with the Sir Richard Branson Entrepreneur Program in the Caribbean, helping entrepreneurs get their business started. And of course, having to deal with something we don't really consider, but having as an entrepreneur, helping them deal with any mental health issues or challenges that they may be struggling with. And I have numerous examples of where that's come to be. So I started my own company focused on mentoring, um, and it's now evolved to one where mentoring is becoming part of the support structure for mental health. And that's kind of the story that I share with people as much as I possibly can. So without going on, that's a little bit about who I am.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And one of the things I would just kind of want to lay out to our listening audience, that the way we're going to do the show, the way I'm going to ask my questions, because of this topic being so important, I broke it down into 5 categories. So I'm going to ask 2 questions per category, and then maybe ask some follow-up questions depending on your answer to those questions. And do I feel that there's a deeper discussion needs to be had on that question? Because the purpose is really the show King Connections is not a play so much on my name, but more of understanding that utilizing a formula called connecting with intent, strategies plus connections plus systems plus value plus capital, social capital helps generate financial capital. is that in these world that we live in right now, everything comes down to what I believe is who you're connected to and who's in your tribe. And the media and society force us into tribes based off our gender, our race, our politics, our religion, sexual orientation, etc. And what I'm advocating is that you should choose your own tribe intentionally of people who you build with and connect with based on alignment, not based on what you have in common, based on principles and behaviors. And so in that space, that's what I really wanted to put my questions into that kind of a context because everybody's going to deal with grief, regardless of your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your age, your country. Grief is going to be, if you're human, you're going to deal with grief in some form at some point in your life, and maybe multiple times throughout your life as well. And so, with that being said, my first question, you describe grief in your book. I believe your subtitle, correct me if I'm wrong, is The Silent Pandemic, Grief Silent Pandemic. And what ways do you think society's approach to grief has led to disconnection rather than healing?
So and I draw on my own personal experience where I I lost my wife to cancer, and I've gone through and still am going through a grieving process, and I have done it eyes wide open in that I have seen how it impacts each and every one of us in a different way, and we need to have the coping mechanisms in place. Each one of us has to have the coping mechanisms in place to be able to deal with that. Now, what's interesting is what I've also seen is that it doesn't matter where you go, I can go to the bank, I can go to the grocery store, or wherever. Somebody in that place, in that business, is either experiencing grief or will be experiencing grief in a relatively short period of time because it's so prevalent in society today that people the most important point I think that to get across is that a lot of people don't know how to deal with their own grief, let alone help somebody else.
Absolutely. And that's something I'm been battling with myself. Like I said, uh, dealing with grief personally now. I've been blessed pretty much most of my life where coming from a small family, mother, father, and just one brother. My father's death came about 10 to 15 years ago. And then my mother, now I'm dealing with her going through the process of aging and transitioning. And be blessed if we get through the remaining part of the year, if she's still alive. But grief really hasn't touched me much because having a small family, I haven't been impacted much by it. And I've been blessed for that. But now that I'm really impacted by losing my mother or being close to it, I feel it, I understand it. And like you said, when you're going through it, there's a lot of emotions, thoughts going through your head. Then you also have to deal with the family elements of it, how other members of your family are dealing with it. And really, that has an impact on me as well, because it's not just how I'm processing it, but how my family is processing, how my brother's processing it, and how that impacts my life. So, and which leads to my next question. Now, your work emphasizes mentorship. How can mentors and leaders create spaces where grief is acknowledged and processed rather than suppressed?
We need to get past the fear of grief. We need to get past. So what I'm basically suggesting is that it's okay to come out of the closet and ask for help, extend your hand and ask for help. And what we need to be able to do is to create those communities, those connections that provide us with the safety that we need in order for us to feel safe enough to be able to deal with grief as it presents itself to each and every one of us in a different manner, as I stated earlier. So I think, when you take a look at all of those things, one of the things that, which kind of leads to what you had started to talk about at the beginning of the show, was the whole aspect of grief and it being a pandemic. My position, and that I stand by it, is that grief is in a pandemic state because it's happening all around us. We don't know how to deal with it, so it continues to grow. It continues to create those challenges. It continues to be a place where we're not sure if we're safe to talk about it. And if we are safe to talk about it, what can we actually say that won't offend, or basically won't offend somebody who may be going through it as well. So it's one of those things where, if we don't address it as leaders in an organization, if we don't create that safe place inside the organization for those conversations to take place, we're just adding fuel to the fire and allowing the pandemic to continue to grow in a similar fashion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, my second set of questions is going to be centered on grief and leadership in business. My question is, many leaders struggle with personal grief while maintaining their professional roles. How can they navigate grief while still leading with integrity and connection?
The big thing there, and I go through this quite often with other leaders, where they're just not, they think it's a sign of weakness if they come forward and say, I'm grieving and I don't know how or where I'm going next with my grief, but would you be so kind as to walk beside me in my grieving process? And those are those sentences, those ideas, those thoughts are what's missing in the majority of the organizations that we know today. And if we can make those changes, like if I think back to my time in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and having to deal with the grief, the loss of somebody in the community, and having to deal with that, but not knowing how to go about dealing with it, and not knowing, you know, is the bottle of Scotch whiskey, is that the alternative to how I'm going to process? Is that one of my coping mechanisms? And I'd like to suggest that it's not. But if the organization does not have the capacity or the capability to be able to provide you the coping mechanisms and the tools that you need to grieve more appropriately, then you're going to go down that slippery slope.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you've mentored many professionals through transitions, including grief. What role does authentic human connections play in the healing process, especially in the workplace?
Well, the big thing that I've found is that you need to be you have to create that safe place for those conversations to take place. That's number one. And the second part is that most leaders, most organizations don't know how to deal with grief. And most people don't know how to deal with grief. Just as an example, I think back to when we had the celebration of life for my wife, Deborah, and I had people coming up to me I hadn't seen in quite a long period of time who said, we should get together for a coffee or get together for a lunch. And, I'm really sorry about your loss. And here we are 4 years later, and I still haven't had the lunch or the coffee because, that particular individual, as there were many, is just not sure how to go about dealing with that particular. How do I talk to somebody who has lost a loved one? How do I go about providing them or helping them get through as much as I possibly can, helping them get through without you know not knowing how to go about doing that. And in a lot of cases, as sort of some words of wisdom is that you need to be comfortable. You need to be able to create that safe place for those conversations to take place. And if you don't know what to say, then don't say anything. Or your other option is you can always ask and say, I really feel, I feel real bad about your loss and everything else. Um, what can I do, or how can I help you, or what are some of the things I can do that can help you with your grieving process?
It's really interesting that you use that as an example. I remember when I was young and I was in my early 20s and I had my working for the government and going to work in a professional setting. I'm still dealing with that, growing, maturing, and I would always ask people, "How you doing?" Just not really caring about how they were doing, but just as a way of saying good morning. And I still wrestle with it today. I have to catch myself. But one day I said that to this gentleman. I said, "How you doing?" And I kept walking. And he said, "Wait a second." I said, and I stopped, and he looked at me. He said, "You asked me how I was doing, and you kept walking.
Yeah.
Let me tell you how I'm doing." And he began to explain to me that his wife was sick, and he was having issues with his children, and he laid out some other things. Again, this was over 30 years ago, but it taught me a very valuable lesson at that point, being intentional with my questions. And as you just laid out, not just saying something for the sake of saying something, but truly, if I'm going to be kind, stopping and ask and being patient enough and being present enough to listen and find out how he's doing, or don't ask that question. And that was a very important lesson because, again, when someone's grieving, as he obviously was, you know, you're going to have a lot of emotions you're dealing with, and you may take it personal that someone's asking that and then just walking away. I might have been the fifth person that did that to him that day, and he decided to just let me know. And it was an important lesson. And to this day, that interaction stays on my mind. I wasn't offended by it. It was a learning experience. So when you just share with that, that just really aligns with that and the importance of it. And which brings to my next question, um, the next segment as well, the role of intentional connection. Um, Now, on my podcast, I emphasize connecting with intent. So again, I truly believe that we need to build relationships intentionally and not just haphazardly for a variety of reasons. But how can those who are grieving build intentional connections that aid in their healing journey?
That's a good question, and one of the things that we definitely need to think about is from the sense of maybe I'll back up a little bit. I belong to a number of support groups, and it's within those support groups that we've created community, a community of connections, and the connections are that we are all experiencing the loss of a loved one in one way, shape, or form. And it's through the connections that we make in that community that it's going to help us with our grieving process. And so I've been like I said, I've been involved in one through the local hospital here. It's run by an absolutely phenomenal lady that she's drawn together a group of volunteers that once a month meet virtually to provide support to newcomers to the group, so people that are more recently lost a loved one. But I've also been involved in providing one-on-one uh, connection with individuals that are struggling with the loss of a loved one, and a number of of things in that vein. So it's really important that organizations, to sort of put kind of the building blocks together, it's really important that organizations that don't have that support structure in place take the steps to build it and put it into place and to nurture it along so that it's there. It's because it's through that community of connections that where we've created a safe place that's going to help us deal with the loss of a loved one. And it's not, we're going to help remove the stigmatism around the aspect of it's a sign of weakness if I show that I'm vulnerable in how I'm dealing with the loss of my family member.
Hmm. You know, I was speaking to a gentleman yesterday as I continue to connect with intent and I build relationships as I continue to add to my tribe. I came across a gentleman who does he's a veteran, does government contracting, and his focus is really helping more veterans and doing staffing to put more veterans and positions and create opportunities for them. And he was sharing with me his pain of how difficult it is to get companies to be willing to work with veterans, and a lot of people over promising and under delivering, and so you're dealing with folks who've gone through some pretty traumatic experience, and then you're disappointing them through their actions. That brings me to my next question, which is, now you've worked with military personnel transitioning into civilian life. How does grief show up in major life transitions, and what strategies help individuals reconnect with their sense of purpose?
That's a good question, because one of the main things to think about is that the sense of purpose is really important. And I'm going to suggest that we as military personnel, we've lost our sense of purpose because of the trauma that we've had to experience going through being of service to others. So one of the things, and I've experienced this myself, number one, as a retired police officer, but also with the individuals that I've worked with through transitioning from service life to civilian life. I've gone through and I've seen the impact that service can actually have on somebody. So how I like to see how we approach it as a group is that it's okay to share those things that you've experienced, and let's talk about some coping mechanisms that we can put into place that's going to help you, but also help me better understand how I can be of service to you as you go through the healing process that you need to go through, that you want to go through, because a lot of the average person today has no idea or concept of what service people go through in being of service to others, in being of service to us as citizens in the community. We have not fully comprehended or understood what they're going through, and you throw a curveball into the mix for them and have them, well, now you have to deal with the loss of a loved one. That's far, far too much for them to have to deal with, in a given period of time. And so finding the coping skills and mechanisms that they need is one of the things that we can give back to them. So, we say, thank you for your service. It should be, thank you for your service, and here's how I can be of service to you.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And that's also going to bring us to our break. We're going to take a quick break for our sponsor, and then we're going to continue our conversation on the other side. So bear with us.
The playbook for growing a local business online is simple. Capture new leads, conversationally convert those leads into sales, turn those customers into positive reviews, and then reactivate those customers into repeat buyers. And that's exactly what our platform does. In order to consistently generate new leads, you first need to be found. The quickest way to get search engines like Google to put your business at the top of search results is by having a steady flow of positive reviews. With our platform, you can show up in search and stand apart from your local competition by easily collecting new customer reviews through text. But getting found is only the beginning. Most consumers choose the first business that responds to them. So unless you start conversations with potential customers almost instantly, they'll go somewhere else. That's why we make starting conversations with website visitors as easy as clicking a button, connecting you instantly through text message so the conversation doesn't end when they leave your website. And we bring all your leads, no matter where they come from, into a single conversation stream that supports text, email, video messaging, Google Business Chats, and even Facebook and Instagram DMs, so you can respond faster and more efficiently than ever. When it comes to turning all those conversations into customers, we make collecting payments just another convenient part of the combo, so you get paid faster no matter how they prefer to pay. Next, you'll want to turn your new customers into happy reviews, which is a snap with our new review request quick actions. The more conversations and customers you generate, the easier it becomes to drive repeat business. We make reactivating contacts into customers as easy as, yup, you guessed it, the push of a button. With bulk actions, you can send out text and email campaigns to generate new sales whenever you have a new update, promotion, or story to tell. We make modern online marketing simple. Let's start growing your business today.
And we're back. This is a second half of our King Connection podcast. And I'm here with Arthur, as well as businessman and grief counselor Doug Lawrence. So we're going to pick back up on our conversation that we're having. We're having a great conversation. I appreciate your answers. As I'm learning through this podcast, how having someone to talk about grief who hasn't experienced grief and understand and has the emotional intelligence to listen and provide solutions, or even just listen a lot of times, is important. And that brings me to my next question, which is, we talked about before how to reconnect veterans with their sense of purpose, but now we want to talk about how we transform pain into purpose. It's my next section of questions. So you mentioned that grief often isolates people. What are some ways individuals can transform their pain into deeper, more meaningful relationships?
Excuse me, I think the biggest it's a challenge, number one, to be able to go through that transition. And so being able to figure out how can I go through that? How can I go on that journey and minimize the amount of pain and suffering and sorrow that I'm going to have to experience in order to get from start to end, if you could equate it in that sort of context from a journey perspective. Of course, we all know that with grief, there's no start and there's no end. It's a continuum that we have to be able to deal with. And that's where, some of the comments that you've made are very good, in that, we a lot of times just don't, we're reluctant to open the door and let people in because of some previous hurt, or maybe we're not sure if I go forward and I walk beside King, for example, what's going to happen is does he understand what I'm experiencing? And that's why these support groups that I talked about before the break, that's why the support groups are so critical, so important, because they provide you with the capability or the capacity to listen and hear. And that's more importantly for somebody who's walking beside you, is to be able to listen and hear what it is that you're experiencing, so that you're in a better place to be able to help them as they continue with their navigating their healing journey.
Absolutely. Now, someone who has mentored thousands of people, what have you learned about the power of human connection in times of deep emotional suffering?
Well, connections, deep emotional connections are, to me, that's an outcome. If I can build uh, if I can build that community, and that community is based on connections, where I've built connections with everybody in the community. Each one of those individuals is dealing with grief in a fashion that is comfortable for them. And if I can do all of that and do that at the same time while creating a safe place for conversations to take place, then I think, we're in a better place. I One of the things I made a note was that I was thinking of when my mom passed away many years ago, and I was given a couple days, 2 or 3 days off to kind of get things in order, help my dad deal with, all the stuff. And one of the things was that because mom had passed so very, very close to the Christmas time period, was the fact that a lot of people didn't know that I just recently lost my mom, because the community that we had was not big enough, number one. Number two, the connections were very one sided. Most people didn't know that I had lost my mother. So, as a result of that, nobody knew how to socially interact with me. As a result of that, my community was very weak when it came to providing the support that I needed to be able to move forward. And number three or four, the connections that I had, some were strong and the rest were not. And there were actually people that didn't even know that my mother had passed away. So it's really, when you look at it from a community and a connection and a safety perspective, all those things are important as we go forth. All those things are important if we're going to provide that meaningful support to walk beside somebody to help them on their healing journey.
Yeah, that's important because as you were talking, I was thinking about how my own family, my uncle died last year, and how his brothers or his sons, I'm sorry, he had four sons, and two of them were from different women,
Yeah.
and they've battled throughout their lives of not knowing each other at all to finding out about each other later when they were grown men and trying to establish relationships. And then when he died, right before he died, how he alienated all of his children to the point where they weren't talking to him, and then they weren't talking to each other. And so forever they still got to process that grief without really having someone they can really lean on to talk about it. Because it's grief from a variety of different perspectives of having brothers and not knowing them your whole life, having a father that you didn't able to resolve any kind of ill will or whatever issues were there before he passed away, and just how that whole process transitioned. And I just think about, I mention that because I'm learning how you assume family can be there when you're going to be there for grief, or when you're going through grief, I should say. But when you're going through it, a lot of times family is not there. Definitely close family is not there. Or family can be there as well, but from my experience, family hasn't been there, and not only my personal family, but and other people who I know tell me about how their family is. And I'm talking about the immediate brothers and sisters, sons and daughters relationship. So again, I'm an advocate behind again building your network, building your tribe, and building with people. So this next group of questions are going to be centered around the importance of building a support network. What advice would you give to someone who wants to support a grieving friend, a colleague, but doesn't know how to approach the conversation?
And I'm going to add a sentence to what we were talking about before we start this part, is that a lot of people have unprocessed grief. So they haven't dealt with it, they haven't worked their way through it. And then we add on top of that the loss of another family member or you know, boyfriend, girlfriend, another person. And it becomes that much more difficult for us to be able to deal with it because we haven't processed the grief that we were dealing with before that. And it's important that you keep that in the back of your mind as you go forward to want to be able to help others. Um, so could I get you to repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, what advice would you give to someone who wants to support a grieving friend or colleague but doesn't know how to approach or initiate the conversation?
So the most important thing to think about in that situation is that the biggest value that you can bring to that relationship is the ability to be able to listen and hear what they say. It's not to pass judgment. So it's to be you. You're not there to pass judgment by any stretch of the imagination. You're not there to diagnose or prescribe or anything like that. Your function, your job, if you want to be of the most value to that person that's grieving, is to listen and hear what it is that they're going through. And, to be able to if you're not sure, I'm a proponent of if you're not sure what to say, then don't say anything. And I think that's probably the best advice I can give is number one, listen and hear, but more importantly, is that if you can't think of anything to say, then don't say anything at all. And the conversation will evolve, unfold itself accordingly based on you know um, who's all in this community. Am I going to be able to build connections? Can I create that safe place for both of us to have this conversation and to be able to build that and get that into places as quickly as we possibly can? Because I'll tell you, grief sucks is my best statement, is because I go through, some of the outcomes I go through is I have periods of time where the loss has trumped everything else, and I'm struggling to try and get through, a weekend. I'm struggling to get through different family events. I'm struggling to get through all sorts of different things that are taking place in my life. And I just need somebody who will listen and hear, and to be able to be there to provide that sort of support is very meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things, I moved to Baltimore City about maybe 7 years ago. And what hit me astonishing about Baltimore City was, and dating someone from Baltimore City, was the amount of grief that people have and what they've gone through. And like when I grew up in St. Louis, when I was young, it would say 1 out of 7 or 1 out of 8 young people would pass away or go to jail or whatever the statistics were. But it was to the point where it was still far enough away where my close circle wasn't really impacted. We knew other people, but we wasn't impacted. When I went to move to Baltimore, I met people women who, if they had any men in their lives, whether it was an uncle or brother or a son or a father, it was a question of either they were in jail, dead, on drugs, or transitioning to jail, coming out of jail, or about to go to jail. So it was always grief centered around that relationship, and made it very difficult to now process. As people like to say, expression is hurt people hurt people. And I've found that to be true firsthand. And not knowing how to even deal with someone who has grief, that much grief, who, as you talked about before, really haven't really dealt with it, haven't had any kind of counseling or a therapist to really kind of work with them. So they just moved on. They try to bow it on and moved on with life so they can continue to live. But that grief shows back up when they're trying to bring in a new relationship to their world and new energy into their world. It shows up. And so it helped me understand in my own journey toward being more fully human that grief is an inevitable part of life. And that brings the question of how can we proactively build resilient relationships that support us through life's hardest moments?
It comes back to the whole aspect of, you had referenced your tribe, and I've referenced my community with the connections and all of that. There are lots of journeys ahead of us that we're going to be experiencing grief as a result of those journeys. And the more that we can prepare ourselves for being able to deal with that. So being able to turn and asking somebody, I need help, is really the first step. And to be able to do that, from the aspect of a community and a community that's connected with connections, and to do that, in a context or in a fashion where we create that community, but it's a community of safety and all of those things. I've got a point that I want to share, and that's, you had talked about individuals, at various stages. So having to going back to jail or going, drugs or all of those things. Those are all coping mechanisms and not good ones, but those have become, coping mechanisms for individuals who are dealing with not so great, of an environment. And that's the place where we can bring them to our community where, we've got people that have experienced grief, that are still experiencing grief. And we can bring those people to our community where we can give them the opportunity to find what works for them in dealing with, with their loss, their grief, and that, being able to deal with it in a fashion that they're comfortable with.
Absolutely. I thank you for that. And I definitely appreciate the conversation. This has been a wonderful discussion. And I see the importance of having someone to talk to more than ever. Um, Unfortunately, my community, my one of my co-hosts and a good friend, he wrote a book. He talks about cultural givens, these things you're given to you based on the culture and environment you grew up in, different expressions of thoughts or perspectives. And one of the cultural givens is, you know, excuse me, one of the cultural givens is that when you grow up in the black community, we don't really see the value of getting therapy, talking to a therapist. It's not something in our community that's part of our culture. And as I've gotten older, I can see the importance of that, having someone to talk to that doesn't have a bias. It's not going to judge you based on what you're saying or use as leverage down the road against you, which sometimes family members do. Not intentionally, it's just a part of being a human. So I see the value that you bring as being a mentor, as being a grief counselor, and writing the books that you wrote. So I just wanted to add that element, the importance of having someone like yourself to talk to and your books to read to even just help cope with some of the grieving that we're going to go through as human beings.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right, is that a lot of us, if we just need that person to extend their hand and offer to walk beside us in order for us to be able to move forward and to deal with things in a not always in a positive context, but certainly we're better positioned to be able to deal with our grief.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, as we wrap up the show, is there anything you want to share with our listening audience, how they can get more information from you, purchase your book, contact you, follow up with you?
Yeah, by all means. So the book is available. The Grief, the Silent Pandemic will be available as of April 20th, I believe it is when it goes live. And it will be available on Amazon.com and Amazon.ca. And so you can, purchase a copy of the book there. And as far as if you want more information, or you feel that I can bring value to a relationship with you, you can reach me through my website at www.talentc, so the word talent with the letter C on the end.ca. And you can also reach out to me through LinkedIn. So I'm fairly busy, very active on LinkedIn. And so you can reach me through there. But probably the easiest way for most of your listening audience would be to send an email to Doug.Lawrence, LAWRENCE, at talentc, so the word talent with the letter C on the end.ca, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I possibly can.
Well, thank you, Doug. And when I post a show, I'll add your contact information and links to your website, your LinkedIn profile, and your email to the show description. So, again, thank you for being a part of the King Connection podcast. It's been a pleasure. It's been insightful, engaging, and a very informative conversation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
You have a blessed and productive remaining part of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.